Good morning. Continuing with our 365 days of Bible study, we are on day 290. We're continuing to look at the Jesus story from St. Mark, which was largely copied in St. Matthew's Gospel and St. Luke's Gospel. Today we have Mark chapter 8, verses 11 to 26, continuing the trouble Jesus had from the Pharisees and from those sent by Herod, and also a miracle, a blind man given his sight. Mark chapter 8, verses 11 to 26. I'll turn you around so you can see the text. The Pharisees came and started an argument with Jesus. To test him, they wanted him to give them a sign from heaven. How deeply he groaned as he said, "Why do people nowadays always want a sign? I'll tell you now, they will not get one." He turned his back on them and got in the boat, heading for the opposite shore. Now, they had forgotten to bring bread. They had only got one loaf with them in the boat. Meanwhile, he was telling them to be cautious. He said, "Listen carefully. I want you to beware of the Pharisees' yeast and of Herod's." Between themselves they were discussing this, concluding that he was talking about their lack of bread. Jesus overheard them and said this to them, "Why are you talking about being short of bread? You don't get it, do you? You're very slow. You've got eyes, but you don't see. You've got ears, but you don't hear. Don't you remember how many basketfuls of leftovers you picked up when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? Yeah, 12, they said. And the 7 for the 4,000? How many basketfuls of leftovers then? 7, they said. And he said to them, Have you got it yet? So they arrived at Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man to him and asked Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man and led him by the hand outside of the village. He used his saliva on the man's eyes and laid his hands on him and asked him if he could see anything. He looked up and said, "I can see people. They look like trees walking." Jesus laid his hands on the man's eyes again. He looked around carefully. His sight had been given back to him. He could see everything in focus. Jesus sent him home, saying, "Don't go back through the village." Well, the reason for Jesus' annoyance with the Pharisees' demand for a sign or a miracle on demand is obvious. Mark's point here is that there were plenty of signs, but not for the Pharisees to see. Because Jesus was discreet in the way he helped people in private, there were no witnesses. What the Pharisees wanted to see was some extravagant miracle done in public that they could report back on. Jesus refused any such sign, turned his back on them, and set off across the lake, leaving them behind. The conversation in the boat may well have been told to Mark by Peter. It was remembered as an embarrassing moment. The disciples were uncomfortable because they hadn't brought enough provisions. So when Jesus starts talking about the Pharisees and Herod and how their influence on society is unseen but pervasive, like the yeast a baker hides in the bread dough, and its effects are not noticed immediately, but only when the bread begins to rise, the disciples miss the point completely and assume Jesus is complaining about them because they've forgotten to bring enough food. He reminds them to rely on him, and he makes them remember how many were fed on meagre rations, leaving a huge amount left over. The healing of the blind man at Bethsaida is one of the few stories that neither Matthew nor Luke copy. Bethsaida was a large town. They had not arrived there, but at the fishing port, which might have been called the village. Once again, Jesus takes the person being healed to a place of some privacy. And uniquely here, Jesus asks the person being healed if he's feeling better. Can you see anything, he says. And it becomes obvious that only a partial healing has taken place. So Jesus has another go. This two-stage healing is unique in all the healing miracles recorded in all the Gospels. Jesus protects himself and the formerly blind man by telling him not to go home via the village. With these 3 brief episodes, Mark ends his story about the travels of Jesus inside and outside of Judea, his teaching and healing ministry. And from Mark chapter 8, verse 27 onwards, we are moving with Jesus inexorably towards the events in Jerusalem, which will lead to the story of his death and resurrection. Tomorrow, we see Jesus' first prediction of these forthcoming events in a very familiar passage which does involve Peter once again. I'll see you tomorrow.